Thomas Pynchon's Gravity's Rainbow is a postmodern novel released in 1973 to critical acclaim and controversy. It's one of the most famously difficult novels in the English language for its narrative complexity and breadth of scope. The novel boasts hundreds of named characters, dozens of themes, and a seemingly tireless creative spirit. If you were to ask a fan of Gravity's Rainbow what the novel was about, they may just shrug their shoulders and say it's about everything. And in some ways, they'd be right. Gravity's Rainbow is what's called an encyclopedic novel, like James Joyce's Ulysses, Lucy Ellmann's Ducks Newburyport, Marcel Proust's In Search of Lost Time, or Adam Levine's The Instructions. There are enormous novels of technical and artistic achievement containing all the known elements of human life. Each trip into one of those novels, you see something new. They're inexhaustible resources of what it means to live a life. For a long time, I thought this kind of storytelling was only possible in literature. Films, I used to think, could never contain the multitudes a novel could. Then I watched A Brighter Summer Day by Edward Yang. It's a 5-hour film about a young gang of boys in mid 20th century Taipei. By the end of the film, you feel as if you've read one of the great classic novels of Tolstoy. It's a film that seems to contain everything. Like Gravity's Rainbow, the story of A Brighter Summer Day is full of tangents, side characters, and themes. It's a dizzying film packed so densely with ideas that you need to watch it at least twice just to keep up with it. The maximalist tendencies of Thomas Pynchon can be found in several postmodern films of the last 20 years. Filmmakers like Charlie Kaufman, Bong Joon-ho, Park Chan-wook, Ari Aster, and the Daniels are making films of breathtaking creative scope and playful tonal shifts which match the literary influences of the genre. But Yang's approach in A Brighter Summer Day is less like the maximalist offerings from those previous directors. Instead of just mashing up all the tones and genres available to a filmmaker, Yang chooses to replicate the encyclopedic novel in a more classical sense, less Thomas Pynchon and more George Eliot. Instead of telling a story about all of humanity that cynically rejects the sincere and the earnest, Yang insists that everything matters instead of nothing. The postmodernists, of course, are capable of sincerity, but the layers of meaning are typically obfuscated by the swinging pendulum of humor and tragedy. When one looks back at the art post World War II, it's infused with an ironic detachment that leans toward the nihilistic. Many of our great encyclopedic novels and the films inspired by the spirit of those novels comment on themselves and the absurdity of their own pursuits. Edward Yang, conversely, uses the trappings of making a, quote, film about everything in a more classical sense, less Charlie Kaufman and more Makioka sisters. In the modern and early postmodern period, the transgression of a novel like Gravity's Rainbow went against the classical sensibilities of the day. But by the time Edward Yang's A Brighter Summer Day was released in 1991, the pendulum had swung toward the postmodernists. As Quentin Tarantino, Steven Soderbergh, Spike Lee, Kevin Smith, and other Western directors began embracing the self reflexive postmodern style of the late 20th century, it was Edward Yang who stood out as a traditionalist who emulated the social commentary novels of more of the 19th century. A Brighter Summer Day is Dickensian in its storytelling, ultimately shedding light on the social politics of 1950s Taipei through the lens of children and teenagers. 9 years later, Edward Yang would make his final film, Yi Yi. Recently, somebody asked me what my favorite film was, and I usually have a few different answers depending on the day. Sometimes it's Paris, Texas. Sometimes it's Ingmar Bergman's Shame or David Lynch's Inland Empire. But if I'm being honest with myself, at the end of the day, there's just one film that could really be my favorite. It's Yi Yi. Like Gravity's Rainbow, when people ask me what Yi Yi is about, I just say everything. It's about what it means to live a life, to have a family, to make a friend, to lose a loved one, to feel regret, to discover yourself. It's a film that contains everything. While A Brighter Summer Day's ambitions and scope match the qualities of Tolstoy or George Eliot or Charles Dickens, Yi Yi contains the same multitudes as one of the great maximalist novels of the late 20th century, but without any of the detached irony. Before we can talk about Yi Yi, though, we first have to talk about the work and legacy of Japanese director Yasujiro Ozu. In the world of film, perhaps no other filmmaker operated with such visual and thematic consistency as Yasujiro Ozu. For over 24 feature films, Ozu's visual style rarely broke out of the strict rules he set for himself. The camera remains still, and the movement of the film comes from the blocking of the actor and the set itself. Doors slide open, characters traverse the frame, and smaller frames focalize the characters. Ozu's visual language cast a shadow over the history of cinema, notably in the films of Wes Anderson and Ho Shin. Wes Anderson employs similar stylistic choices in his films to those found in Ozu's Technicolor films. The mise-en-scène of a film like Good Morning would be right at home in one of Anderson's movies. The influence is so obvious that direct homages are paid to Ozu in Anderson's stop-motion film Isle of Dogs. While Ozu's visual consistency is perhaps easier to spot in the films of those he influenced, his frequent themes of domestic life and the conflicts between tradition and progress have also made themselves apparent in the work of other filmmakers. Ho Shin, the other Taiwanese director of films such as Millennium Mambo, Flowers of Shanghai, and Café Lumiere, reflect Ozu's narrative style and thematic interests. Flowers of Shanghai, Shin's 1998 film, unfolds over a series of long conversations between characters in a Shanghai brothel. Even though the visual language of this film strays from Ozu's typical aesthetic, his influences shine through in the ways in which the conversations unfold around dinner tables, how characters behave differently according to social expectations, and how the conflict revolves around aspects of tradition and progress. The narrative consciously highlights the influence of Ozu through the writing and performances. Ho Shin's later film, Café Lumiere, is wholly influenced by the work of Ozu and in some ways feels like an extension of Ozu's contributions to cinematic storytelling. Yes, this video is about Edward Yang's final film, Yi Yi, but the influence of Ozu, not only on this film but on Yang's contemporaries, is an important access point for understanding this film as a whole. Ozu's titanic reputation in cinema hangs over not only East Asian filmmakers, but filmmakers all over the world. Wes Anderson and Ho Shin certainly continue the legacy left behind by Ozu, but no other filmmaker adapted and evolved the Ozu house style like Edward Yang. Over a career spanning 7 feature films, Edward Yang cemented himself as one of the most important cinematic voices of his generation. Despite his sudden death from colon cancer in 2007 at the age of 59, Yang's legacy and influence remains as strong as ever today. If Ozu was the father of the domestic drama, then Yang was the son who continued and strengthened that legacy. In Edward Yang's final film, Yi Yi, the visual language reflects that of Ozu, but unlike other filmmakers who simply imitate the symmetry, the blocking, and the still frames of the Japanese master, Yang evolves that style to match the changing values of Taiwan's culture. Like Ozu, Yang's camera rarely moves, and the motion of the image comes from the blocking of the actors and the sets. Almost none of the story unfolds in close-up, but instead in sustained mediums and wides. However, as a smart evolution of Ozu's domestic vision, Yang takes that house style out of the house, instead utilizing the controlled tableau to further distance his characters from one another and highlight the encroaching modern world onto private family life. Yi Yi is not only important because it's Edward Yang's final film, it's important because its depiction of one family's crisis reflects the changing culture of the new millennium. Yi Yi, in its own quiet way, is one of the most profound movies ever made about the human condition. Yi Yi is ultimately a film about the cycles of life. We watch as three generations of a family experience life's most important elements: marriage, first love, discovery, heartbreak, friendship, regret, faith. The film is about all of it. When one character falls in love, another character's heart is broken. When one character's life ends, another begins. The film itself acts as one large cycle, starting with a wedding and ending with a funeral. It's a film that contains everything, every important moment of a life. But the profound way Yang approaches these moments is in the ways he juxtaposes them. Think of the film as one large reflective surface where every element's opposite balances the other. The title itself is displayed as a reflection, Yi Yi, two identical strokes, one a copy of the other. Not two, but two ones on top of the other. The scenes are connected but also distinct from each other. Yang's mise-en-scène relies on reflective surfaces and frames within frames. Nearly every scene of the film is shot against a mirror or another reflective surface, separating the audience from the characters themselves. These reflections, copies, and distortions all feed each other and amplify the main theme of the film, that we all feel alone, but we are also never alone. No human feeling is ever felt alone, but is instead reflected endlessly and universally in all of those around us. Just as Ozu's magnum opus, Tokyo Story, charts a family in the midst of a generational shift, Yi Yi charts the shift of an entire culture through the lives of one family at the turn of the 21st century. Tokyo Story's plot unfolds around a series of conversations between characters, frequently over meals or household chores, and Yi Yi's plot follows a similar pattern. It's in these domestic conversations that the work of Ozu becomes universal and timeless, and Yang captures that same universality with his work in Yi Yi. The story of Yi Yi begins with a wedding and ends at a funeral. The wedding, a rushed affair prompted by a surprise pregnancy, allows for the audience to meet three generations of the Jian family of Taipei. The man getting married, Adi, believes in the power of luck, and he has chosen his wedding day, his daughter's name, and his financial future all based on his superstitions. Adi's character, large and boisterous and superstitious and impulsive, acts as a direct foil to his brother-in-law, NJ, a small, introspective, careful patriarch of the Jian family. At the wedding, as Adi and his new bride celebrate, NJ quietly moves through the ceremony without drawing attention to himself. It's NJ who stands as the central figure of this mostly ensemble film. The grandmother, a traditional and stern matriarch who stands firmly against Adi's marriage, suffers a stroke early in the film. For the rest of the movie, the grandmother lies silently in bed in the Jian apartment. Throughout the movie, various characters sit with the grandmother and tell her about their lives. NJ is an executive at a large software company that has seen a steep downturn in profits, and NJ has been tasked with hiring an expensive and lucrative video game developer from Japan, a mysterious figure named Ota, to jumpstart his company's success as it enters the new millennium. At Adi's wedding, NJ runs into a woman, Sherry, his first love, and the two exchange phone numbers. NJ is a quiet man. He often puts his headphones in and tunes out the rest of the world. He takes a back seat to conversation, and for the first half of the film, NJ rarely makes decisions for himself. He doesn't seem to know how he became an executive of his company, nor does he agree with the constant disregard for great art for the sake of profits. NJ's wife, Minmin, is so distraught by her mother's stroke that she abandons the family to join a religious cult up in the mountains. For much of the movie, her absence fills the spaces of the Jian apartment. NJ and Minmin's daughter, Ting Ting, is a high-achieving musician and student. She feels jealousy toward her free-spirited neighbor and her boyfriend, a boy called Fatty. The youngest member of the Jian family, Yang Yang, is an introspective and inquisitive boy who is tormented at school by a group of girls and his teacher. Yang Yang reflects his father's loner personality, and we watch as Yang Yang becomes fascinated by photography over the course of his story. It's important to note that Yang Yang is the director's namesake, and as a budding young photographer who grapples with the ways in which he can help people get perspective on their lives, one can see the director himself grappling with his own role as an artist. Not unlike other large ensemble movies like those of Robert Altman or the early films of Paul Thomas Anderson, Yi Yi's structure is episodic. There isn't so much a single plot, but rather a series of themes which are explored through the connections between the characters in small vignettes. It's the relationships between these scenes which give them larger purpose and meaning. For example, late in the film, as Ting Ting and her new boyfriend find a hotel room to sleep together, Ting Ting's father does the same thing with Sherry miles away in Tokyo. These two scenes reflect one another, echoing over space and generations. The cinematic influence of Ozu stretches across Yi Yi like a stylistic blanket. Similar to Ozu's domestic dramas, the film exists as a conversation between members of a family, rarely ever leaving the common areas of domesticity. Yang's camera, like Ozu's camera, is ever patient and still, and Yang's impeccable blocking makes each frame come alive. It's not the camera that moves, but the objects within the frame. When he was a young man, Edward Yang was accepted to the Harvard School of Architecture, and while he never pursued architecture as a career, Yang's interest in the power of our physical spaces informs much of his visual style. The framing and blocking of his scenes can only be described as architectural. The spaces of the sets and locations frame the characters within the larger mise-en-scène. With his camera pulled further away from the characters than audiences may be used to, Yang accents the narrative or thematic events of each sequence with the physical spaces they inhabit. For example, several scenes of the film take place in the liminal spaces of city life. Overpasses, hallways, elevators, staircases, and waiting rooms are places the Jian family occupy through much of the film. Thematically, these liminal spaces highlight the generational gray area between the characters and of Taipei itself at the turn of the century. Taiwan's political identity has changed throughout its history. The 20th century alone saw Taiwan occupied by two rival nations, Japan and China, and the nebulous political identity of Taiwan is exemplified also by the liminal spaces of the film. Even the languages used in the film, Mandarin, Japanese, English, and the Taiwanese variant of Hokkien, a language reflective of the Chinese diaspora, help express the politically complicated history of Taiwan within the lifetimes of some of its characters. While Mandarin is spoken by all generations in this film, only the older characters speak Hokkien, and only when they're speaking to each other. This shared language among the older characters provides a window into which the generational gap between characters like NJ and Ting Ting, and it helps reinforce the distinct separation between the members of the Jian family. The Japanese character, Ota, speaks Japanese with a translator nearby, further cementing the absence of Japan's influence in Taipei so long after its occupation, and the English language is the only way NJ and Ota are able to speak to one another, representing the language of Western commerce infiltrating the island of Taiwan. Yi Yi is a dense film, even when you don't take the actual narrative into account, just the visual choices of the reflections and the frames within frames, the location choices of the liminal spaces, and the various languages spoken by the characters point toward the thematic concerns of the film. The title of Yi Yi is multifaceted. In Mandarin, the title is two characters, 1, 1. Not the number 2, but just 2 ones. In the West, the title has been translated to a 1 and a 2, like a band leader counting time. Both of these titles reflect the thematic interest of writer-director Edward Yang. Like Yang's previous work, particularly A Brighter Summer Day, Yi Yi thematically investigates the relationship between the traditional and the progressive. While A Brighter Summer Day is a 5-hour epic with much more formally ambitious trappings, Yi Yi is no less ambitious with its political and social ideas. While I personally lack a full or even nuanced understanding of Taiwan's history, it's Still easy to see how Yang has cast his characters as aspects of his complicated history. However, as I do lack the appropriate cultural or historical knowledge to dive deeper into this aspect of the film, I will be focusing more on the universal humanitarian aims of the film's themes. Yi Yi's emphasis on reflected separation ripples through every scene. While only 2 sequences combine the entire family in one place, through the editing and structure of the film itself, the Jian family is always operating in concert. When Yang stands precariously in front of a body of water, his dad does the same. When one couple fights in their bedroom, another does so next door. In one of the most densely populated cities in the world, the Jian family struggled to connect not only with each other, but with anybody. The most plot-focused narratives of Yi Yi are the ones belonging to software salesman NJ and his daughter, Ting Ting. NJ has a crisis of identity. His company is ruthlessly led by a wealthy, womanizing cheapskate, and Oda has become disenchanted with the prospect of creating artless and cheap software. After his wife leaves to join a religious cult, NJ rekindles a friendship with a woman he dated many years before, who is now married to an American businessman. After a chance meeting at his cousin's wedding reception, NJ starts communicating with his former girlfriend, Sherry. In the past, NJ and Sherry had agreed to meet and start their new life together, but NJ stood her up. Now, 20 years later, NJ expresses regret over that decision, and Sherry still hasn't gotten over the emotional fallout. While NJ attempts to correct the wrongs of his first love, Ting Ting experiences her first love with a boy named Fatty, who has a tumultuous relationship with Ting Ting's next-door neighbor. While Fatty and Ting Ting's neighbor break off their relationship, Ting Ting begins dating him, which contains echoes of NJ and Sherry's recollections. Yang places these sequences beside each other to accentuate the relationship between these dynamics and the cycles of life within the Jian family. Mirroring Ting Ting's new love is her younger brother, Yang, who discovers an interest in the opposite sex for the first time. Separately, these stories act as small windows into a single life, and together they paint a portrait of the entirety of a romantic relationship. NJ's narrative also follows his burgeoning friendship with Japanese software developer Ota, an enigmatic and singular figure in the context of this film. If Yi Yi were a hero's journey, then Ota would be the oracle. Sometimes he barely registers as a character at all, and more as a foil who only exists to contextualize NJ's internal life. While the film never goes as deep into the character of Ota as it does NJ, it's the scenes featuring Ota which contain the strongest emotional elements in the film, barring that heartbreaking final scene. Near the beginning of the film, NJ's company talks about hiring Ota, a video game developer from Japan, to jumpstart a new venture for the company. NJ meets Ota, and while their first meeting is mostly about business, the 2 men connect over their shared love of music. In the Jian apartment, Beatles and Bob Dylan memorabilia cover the walls, and NJ spends much of the film immersed in the music playing through his headphones. However, upon getting in NJ's car after their first meeting, Oda hears NJ's classical music playing over his speakers. Oda is excited by this shared love, and their friendship begins in earnest. Later, at a karaoke bar, Oda plays Moonlight Sonata on the piano. NJ and Oda's connection represents a new kind of life for NJ. The quiet and insular man we meet at the beginning of the film blooms into an open, emotionally present person. As NJ gets closer to Ota, NJ's company searches for a cheaper copycat version of the service Oda provides. Later in the film, pointedly, the copycat turns out to be too cheap and ruins their financial prospects. Edward Yang's own relationship with art and commerce is expressed through NJ and Oda's conversations. While Oda is a genius of his craft and while NJ is interested in working with Oda, the company itself questions the financial burden of creating meaningful art. Yang's own relationship to commerce is clearly laid out by how difficult it is to find his films. Aside from A Brighter Summer Day and Yi Yi, films distributed by the Criterion Collection, his other films are more difficult to get a hold of. Taipei Story is a part of a Criterion box set, but his other films are frequently hard or impossible to find. Yang never much cared to sell his films commercially. Even Yi Yi, his most widely seen and celebrated film, didn't even get a formal release in his home country of Taiwan until nearly 8 years after it was produced. At the beginning of the film, MJ gives Yang Yang a camera, and for much of the film's runtime, Yang Yang takes bizarre photos and trains himself to hold his breath for longer and longer stretches of time. It's Yang Yang's conversation with NJ that reveals the theme of the film. When looking at Yang Yang's photographs of the backs of people's heads, NJ asks why Yang Yang has chosen this particular subject. The reflections in characters, plots, and images throughout the film represent the limited perspective of a single human being. We require the perspective of those around us to fully understand the life we're living. Yang Yang, through his art, is able to understand his own value by completing the perspective of others. And of course, it's Yang Yang who shares his name with Edward Yang, the director of this film. NJ, who mirrors Yang Yang in his introspection, travels to Japan to meet with Ota, the video game designer. The two men nurture a burgeoning friendship, and over the course of his visit, NJ begins to open up to Ota. Ota feels like a version of NJ as well, perhaps what NJ could have become had he been more confident or open to expression. Perhaps what would have happened had NJ chosen to be an artist instead of a businessman. NJ prevents himself from living freely because of his anxieties and social constraints, and he tells Ota about the fears he has for his future. Ota says, "Why are we always afraid of the first time? Every day in life is a first time. Every morning is new. We never live the same day twice. We're never afraid of getting up every morning. Why?" Throughout Yi Yi, we paradoxically watch NJ recreate his failed first love, but instead of rectifying his past mistakes, he makes the same ones over again. In Taipei, Ting Ting recreates the mistakes of her father in an almost identical fashion, and in his first love, Yang Yang does the same. These similarities are reflected everywhere in Yi Yi, these endlessly repeating cycles of a human life. After failing with Sherry in Japan, NJ recognizes the futility of the cycles, saying, "I had a chance to relive part of my youth. My first thought was, then I could make things turn out differently, but they turned out the same or not much different. I suddenly realized that even if I was given a second chance, I wouldn't need it. I really wouldn't." NJ's failures pile up throughout Yi Yi. He resists being emotionally available to his wife, who has to leave the house to find her own emotional stability. He is sent out to recruit Ota for his company, but his company shuts down the merger. He wants to reconnect with Sherry, but he can't bring himself to connect with her. NJ's absence at home allows for Ting Ting to make risky choices with a boy she barely knows, and Yang Yang gets in increasingly more trouble at school. NJ's inability to take action in his own life reverberates through the lives of everybody else in his family. His attempts to be easygoing, to be non-confrontational, to be invisible, result in his life becoming occupied by the people around him, not unlike the history of Taiwan itself during the early 20th century. NJ's children, unlike NJ, are rarely passive. Ting Ting stands up for herself, Yang Yang fights back against his bullies, and Ota rejects the business of NJ's corrupt company. It's Ota who recognizes the elemental goodness of NJ, and who also recognizes the inherent fragility that goodness is made of. For NJ, even when he recognizes the eternal cycles of life, he never behaves like the future is written. As a foil to NJ, his cousin, Adi, bases his entire life on the luck of the calendar and his superstitions. NJ's practicality is contrasted in Adi's insistence that luck is the major ingredient of every failure or success. In the opening of the film, Adi confesses he chose his wedding day to be on the luckiest day of the year, and he avoids naming his daughter for weeks to find the luckiest possible name for her. When finances get tight because of Adi's constant gambling, he relies on his luck to get him out of the problem. However, NJ and Adi both end up in a similar crisis at the halfway point of the film. NJ questions the value of his own life and his own effectiveness as a father when his efforts yield no fruit, and Adi attempts to end his own life when he believes his superstitions are no longer true. Edward Yang's refusal to cast judgment on either man indicates the film's central message. that people always believe they are alone, but they have really never once been alone. We all struggle through the same life, stuck in the same cycles, and the only thing that truly gives us meaning is finding a harmony between us. The Taiwanese title of the film is Two Separate Ones, but the Western title, A One and a Two, hints at the musical. The film isn't just about people living their separate lives, but about the harmonious connections between all of us. As the conductor of the events of this film, Yang uses the language of film editing to put the entirety of human existence into perspective. While Yi can be categorized as an encyclopedic film in the way some novels can, it's certainly not the only film of its kind. Edward Yang passed away in the years after the release of this film at the age of 59, but other filmmakers still carry the torch of Yang's style and themes. The films of American director Kenneth Lonergan, particularly his film Margaret, utilized the life of the city around its characters much like Yang does in Yi. Lonergan's films also focus on a small number of people and unfold in similarly novelistic fashion. For example, Margaret uses a teenage girl's personal tragedy to investigate post-9/11 New York, just as Yang uses the Jian family to highlight the political and social history of Taiwan. More about Margaret will be revealed in a later video. A contemporary of Yang, Hirokazu Koreeda, also continues the tradition of Ozu through his domestic dramas. Films like Still Walking and Like Father, Like Son would feel right at home in the hands of Edward Yang. More recently, the work of Raisuke Hamaguchi reflects Yang's patient storytelling and interest in combining the philosophical with the social. His film Happy Hour, in particular, feels like a film hugely inspired by Yi in its approach to both storytelling and theme. Yi is a brilliant film containing multitudes. Each time I watch it, it's easy to find new avenues of thought and new points of connection. Like any great film or piece of art, it somehow packs the human experience into its runtime, and Yang makes that impossible task seem easy. Have you seen Yi? How does it resonate with you? Let me know in the comments below. Also, what film should I cover next? Thanks for watching.